Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Bienvenidos. Welcome. I'm Rob Martinez. I'm state historian of New Mexico. And I'm going to be spending some time talking about not only the role of the state historian, but my own career, my own journey to becoming the state historian. When I first started putting this presentation together, it lasted all of about 10 minutes. So I thought, well, I need to talk a little bit more about how I got to be a historian, so you can get a better idea of who I am. It was quite a journey for me to be a state historian. It's been a long and winding road. So what I'd like you to do now is put the PowerPoint up so I can start my presentation.
You got it.
Sorry about that.
No problem. All right, there you go. The role of the state historian, Rob Martinez, state historian, that's me. Before I get started, I have a little memory about this room right here. This beautiful little intimate auditorium used to be a little bit different. There used to be a window back here, and I've performed music up here many times. I realized when I came in here, I said, this looks familiar. Well, my dad's group, Los Reyes Albuquerque, they used to have a program, the city of Albuquerque, called Maduro de la Cultura. I don't know if some of you have heard of it, but back in the 90s, I used to play right up here. So that's my little memory of this stage up here. Now here I am, the role of the state historian. So next. So let's look at this slide here, history and culture, because history and culture are at the heart of what I do. What is history? That's when our ancestors started writing things down. Prehistory is before that, when we were nomadic. Then we became sedentary and civilization began. That's a bit of a traditional way of looking at history. Now we're looking at different definitions of history for different cultures, such as oral histories, glyphs, different ways of recording histories, stories and songs and dance. So what is culture? The characteristics of a particular group of people defined by everything from language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. New Mexican culture is influenced by the many groups of people that now make up the state. Everyone in this room has a culture. Everyone in this room has a history, and we all have very diverse backgrounds. It's one of the brilliant things about New Mexico history, and one of the maddening things about it, right? To be, especially for a state historian. I'll talk about that a little later. I love this quote. I was reading an article in the Santa Fe New Mexican about, I think it was about Okeawinge Pueblo, and they showed one of the Puebloan dancers. And he said, our history book is our dance. And that's a picture or a recreation, a computer generation of Chaco Canyon. You could see the dwellings there. It's a very spiritual center, all those kivas. I used to think people lived in those apartments, but I think they were just visiting, like making a pilgrimage like you do to Jerusalem or Rome or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But this is native New Mexico going back to about like the 1200s or the 1300s. But the point I'm trying to make is they've had their own history for a very long time. So New Mexico historians, this touches on what I was saying about Chaco, and this is Acoma Pueblo to the west of Albuquerque. And my point is, Pueblo people, Dene, the Navajo, the Apache, the Comanche, they've been handing down their stories from generation to generation, parents to children. Those are historians. Okay, we need to expand our horizons as to what a historian is. It's not just somebody writing a book on a computer or a typewriter or writing things down. Yes, that's important, but so are all the stories that have been handed down from generation to generation. And it's not unique to native New Mexico. All cultures, if you go back far enough, this is how people told their story. So, let's get into the era of statehood. 1912, we become a state. There were historians before that. There were priests during the colonial period who recorded our history. Gaspar Pérez de Villagra wrote La Historia de la Nuevo México in 1610. That was our Spanish history. Again, reports by priests about New Mexico. That was our history. Governors' reports. And then you get into the Mexican period and you have the same thing going on. People like Padre Martinez of Taos, who had a printing press. He wrote workbooks and histories, and he was very much about literacy for the poor people of New Mexico. And when you get into the territorial period, when we finally get our own Catholic bishop, Lamy, and the priests that are coming with him, the French priests, they also start writing the history of New Mexico from the Catholic Church's perspective. We had one gentleman who was a territorial historian in the early 1900s, Francisco Chavez, and he was a historian for New Mexico. But it's not till 1945 that this guy, George Curry, is appointed the first state historian. He was a territorial governor right before we became a state in 1912. And he clearly had an interest in being the state historian. The governor appointed him in 1945. It was more or less an honorary title back then. He was not a trained historian, but he had a fascination and a passion for our territorial period, and he was known to study the cattle brands of New Mexico and the different battles that took place during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. He was state historian from 1945 to 1947, and as state historian myself, what I found probably most fascinating about his appointment was that to be state historian, you had to live in Lincoln, New Mexico. It's true. I think that's where he lived. And I believe his salary was somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 a year, about what I'm getting right now. Some things never change. But he did a great job, but because of finances and for whatever reason, we did not have a state historian for another 20 years once he passed away, which is a shame. Because it should have been something that was continued since 1947. So think about that, a 20-year gap of no one doing our official history. So let's talk about the modern state historian of New Mexico, the position that I occupy. There's this gap here I talked about, no state historian for 20 years. In 1967, the State Commission on Historic Sites was created, Cultural Properties Review Committee. The state archivist at that point was designated as state historian. And back then, that was Myra Ellen Jenkins. So that's when this starts. Think about that. The state archivist was also the state historian. 2 years later, 1969, the state historian was named statutory member of the CPRC, the Cultural Properties Review Committee. To this day, the state historian is the only statutory member of that committee. By 1971, you have the Division of Historical Services, and in 1980, the state historian position was separated from the state archivist. That's when you have that separation. And then in 2001, the Office of the State Historian Division was created, separate from the Archives Division. Before that, the state historian worked in the Archives Division. So the mission of the state historian is to foster and facilitate an appreciation and understanding of New Mexico history and culture through education, research, preservation, and community outreach. Well, this is what all historians do. I know there's historians out here. Everybody does that. That's what you do as a historian or as a teacher, right? Because the role of a historian essentially is a teacher. I love that mission statement because it's so broad. It's so broad. You can do so much and so many different things. And I'll probably say this throughout the duration of this presentation. The state historian, whoever it is, it's kind of what they make of it. Every state historian has been different from the other. There's certain things at the core of the position that you have to do, but then there's a lot of room to bring your own perspectives and your own style to the job. All right, there's Myra Ellen Jenkins, 1967. She did the job, let's see, let me do my math, for about 13 years, okay? I read a lot of interesting things on social media, on Facebook and YouTube about state historian, and people have a lot of interesting ideas out there. Some of them are correct, but some of them are just a little bit off the mark. One person wrote that the state historian just quietly sits in an archive documenting New Mexico history. And that's it. Well, Myra Ellen Jenkins, she was fiery. She was a force. The most famous thing that I've heard about her, I didn't get to meet her, but she had a very public disagreement with Reyes Lopez Tijerina. I don't know if some of you remember that. They did not agree on how to interpret land grants, the old documents, and so she eventually came to his side, and when he was arrested for the events up at Tierra Maria, she wrote a letter to Governor Cargo in support of Reyes Lopez Tijerina. And I love that story because I always say, I learned this from a professor at UNM, as a historian, I always reserve the right to change my mind when I'm presented with new evidence. And I think that's always a good rule of thumb. Okay, Hilario Romero, I run into this guy all the time, and he's a musician too. He was state historian in 1980 for about 6 months. He is a fiery guy too, and very controversial, and he has, again, history has many different perspectives. Okay, and he certainly has a very strong and determined view of our history here in New Mexico. So he lasted more or less 6 months, 8 months, something like that. I'm not sure exactly. But after he left.
Rob, did you say that the governor appoints the historian?
No,
Oh.
I never said that. Wait, I did say that. George Curry was appointed. Starting in 1967, the state historian is not appointed by the governor or the Commission of Public Records. It's a classified job. It's not GovX. It's the state historian is not appointed or elected. It's a regular state job. All right. 1981, Stan Horty started working as state historian. Stan's a good friend of mine. I've done work for him. We'll talk about that later. But he ruffled feathers when he suggested that we Hispanic New Mexicans may have a Jewish past. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's another aspect of our history where you go, whoa, this is something I didn't know about. I had read about that in Fray Angelico Chavez's book, My Penitente Land, but he touches on that. But Stan Horty's really took it to the mat, and you know, a lot of people loved what he had to say, but some people disagreed with him fiercely. You know, we New Mexicans, we're Spanish and Mexican, and we're Catholic. We're Catholic through and through for the last 10 billion years, right? Well, you know, our history is a lot more diverse than that. Because of Stan, he's helped bring to our attention that we have a Jewish past, a major contribution to our history, to Spain's history, to Latin America's history, and New Mexico included. And we're also starting to realize and look at our Moorish and Muslim past as well. He was the historian for about 4 years. And then Robert Torres became state historian in 1987. I just saw Robert about a week ago at a conference, and he's still the same. He's still the same. He's a wonderful presenter. He's a man of the people. And he worked in the archives when they used to be on Guadalupe Street in Santa Fe. And that's where when I first went to the archives, when he was state historian, and we went to the old archive building. And back then, you know, it's such a different world now for all of us doing research. We were talking about what his job was like. He goes, well, he said, I'd get a letter in the mail. Someone would ask me a historical question. I'd take a few days to research it. I'd type my response on a typewriter, fold it, put it in an envelope, and then mail it back to them. Very different. He was state historian for 13 years, and then the State Record Center and Archives moved from Guadalupe to where we are now on Camino Carlos Rey in Santa Fe. Next up in 2001 was Esteban Galvez. He is the one who turned the office of the state historian position into a division. He had the vision of a division, okay? He's the one who took the job from the archive division and created the state historian as a division director, which means we also have administrative duties, but also historian duties, and also created the position of assistant state historian, and we also an administrative assistant. So it was a 3-person operation, and he did the job for about 8 or 9 years, and then he went on to become the director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center. He's currently director of Native Bound Unbound, organization he's created. Actually, it's a project to study Native American slavery and servitude. He started with New Mexico, but he got a big grant. Now he's looking at, well, all the way from Canada down to Chile in South America. So it's a pretty cool project. Rick Hendricks. Rick Hendricks became state historian in 2010. And during his tenure, state historian, the historian's office remained a 3-person operation. And it's during his tenure that I was hired as assistant state historian in 2012. And then about 4 or 5 years later, my title was changed to deputy state historian. And I used to joke with Rick because we'd give talks together, or I'd tell people I'm deputy state historian. That means I get to carry a gun with no bullets. So that was, Barney Fife. Okay. Anyway, it was a good run for about 6 years. He was there for about 9 years, and then he became the SRA, the State Records Administrator, which he is currently doing right now. He's now the director of the whole operation, archives, Office of the State Historian, information technology, records management, rulemaking. So he's in charge of those operations, and he has written so many books, and he was for 20 years one of the editors at the Vargas Project. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then this guy became state historian in 2019. June of 2019, I interviewed and was hired as state historian. And it was fantastic, it still is. But about 9 months later, COVID. And it became a whole other ballgame. So how did I get to this place, state historian of New Mexico? Well, I've always had an interest in history. My family are musicians. We play mariachi music. We play New Mexico violin and guitar music. My father was a corridista, corrido composer. He's from Mora in northern New Mexico. My mom's from Las Vegas, New Mexico. And I've always had an interest in our history. I started reading Fray Angelico Chavez, like a lot of people. And then after I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years playing rock music, yes, I had a great time too. But after a while, I realized I had to get a real job. So I avoided that by going back to college. I went to get a master's degree in history, and I was really lucky. I remembered a guy named John Kessel, Professor Kessel. I remembered him from my undergrad years. I took a history class from him, New Mexico history. So I was studying in Spain in 1983, and I met an attorney. He goes, I just met a guy who you might want to meet. His name's John Kessel, and he started a project called the Vargas Project. And he's looking at all these old documents about New Mexico history. So when I went back in 1993 to get my master's degree, I went to Professor Kessel's office, and I said, I want to work for the Vargas Project. I want to learn how to read the old documents. I'll work for free. I'll take the garbage out. I don't care. I'll do whatever it takes. And he says, that's great. You don't have to take the garbage out. But right now we don't have a position. So I said, okay, let me know if you get one. So he called me literally about 2 weeks later, and he said, we have a position. Go talk to Rick Hendricks and Meredith Dodge upstairs at Mesa Vista. Tell them I sent you. So I went up there, and they gave me a big facsimile, a sheet of paper of an old document from the 1700s. And they said, go in the hall with this pencil and write down what you understand. And I couldn't read any of it. I think I wrote down about 20 words. I said, I can't do this. I was ready to just go, thanks, I guess I'll go flip burgers at the Frontier or something, And they looked and they said, actually, you did quite well. We'll hire you. So that started me learning how to read the old documents. I learned later on that the fancy word for that is paleography. Okay. So they would have me proofing what they had already transcribed to learn how to read the old handwriting and compare it to what they did. And it's a whole other language. But these are the books, and my name appears in the acknowledgments, starting with the Royal Crown Restored, and I'm all the way over there to the last one. So that's the Vargas Project. I worked there from about 1993 to 1997, learning research, paleography, and editing. So it was a great, great experience. After that, I was hired by Stan Horty. There he is. He's the former state historian. He started a project studying the crypto-Jewish phenomenon in New Mexico. And he called me up in 1999. He goes, you know how to read old documents? I said, sure. He goes, well, I need somebody to travel around to Mexico, Spain, France, and Italy. Would you like to do that and get paid? And I said, well, let me think about it. Yes. So over the years, I've gone to Spain and those different places, Mexico many times with Stan and on my own doing research. There we are at the Duque de Alba archives in Madrid in 2011. We're just combing through documents and guides, trying to find as much information as we can. And it's always been a great experience to just get to dig in these civil and church documents. And the archives are fantastic. But it's funny, in Spain, I don't know if it's funny, but when you go into these archives, well, first of all, you learn something. If the archives open at 9 and you show up at 9 and you're waiting there, and the archivist usually shows up about 9:20 or 9:30, they're not happy about that, because then you're putting them to work right away, and they want to get their café con leche and their, tortilla española. But they also, you go and they have signs, no fumar, no smoking. And then they bring you your books with a cigarette hanging out of their mouth. And it's interesting. So I'm going to show you just some photos, just the experiences I've had. This is me doing research in Spain in 1999. That gentleman is the historian in Corral de Almaguer, where the Romero family of New Mexico came from in 1598. He took us into the archives there, and I don't remember his full name, but I do remember his last name because it's Varela, just like New Mexico. I thought that was cool. Stan sent me to France in the year 2000. He wanted me to look up the Archevêque and Gouroulet families. So I was in Bayonne, I was in Bordeaux. They have really good wine there. La Rochelle, and there I am doing my best effort to look French. And behind me is the old house of the Archevêque family, that red building to the right.
Where?
In Bayonne, in the Basque Country. Basque Country straddles both France and Spain. So that's where that family came from. I went with Stan in 2008 to do research in London. He was trying to find crypto Jews in the Caribbean. So we went to the British Library to look at all the old documents that the British might have had referencing Jewish people in Jamaica, because Jamaica was a British holding, but before that it was Spanish. And you see a lot of Columbus, Cristobal Colon, his family, you see their name in those documents in Jamaica. And that's the neighborhood where we had rented an apartment for a couple of weeks to do research. There I am with Stan Horties in Havana, Cuba. We were able to go there twice. That looks like the first time in 2008, and then we went again in 2016. It's interesting, two different presidents, and we were able to go, but I can't remember which trip, but our government had made a mistake. They had issued us I think it was the first time they issued us visas to do research, academic visas. But the other time, they gave us visas to vacation. So when we flew into Havana from Miami, they pulled me into a back room to interrogate me. And it was quite nerve-wracking. I was there for an hour and a half, and they kept saying, "What are you doing in Havana?" In Spanish, of course. "What are you doing here?" I said, "Here to do research." He goes, "You can't do research. You're supposed to have fun." I said, "I'm here to do research." He says, "You can't. You cannot do research with this. You have to enjoy yourself." So Stan's such a good sport. Every evening after we did research, he would take us all out and say, "We're just doing what the government told us to do." Again, I don't know how interesting it is, but when we flew back to the United States, when we got to Miami, our government pulled me into the back and interrogated me for an hour and a half about what the heck was I doing in Havana, Cuba. So interesting. All right. One of the most interesting things I got to do around 2001, 2002, I was approached by the family of Carlos Santana to do his genealogy for a museum exhibit in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills, the Museum of Tolerance. So I was flown down to Mexico, down to Jalisco, where his family is from. I met up with his brother, Jorge, who has since passed away. And we drove all over looking at these church and civil archives in these little towns in Jalisco, researching his family. And his family looks a lot like New Mexican families, a mix of Spanish, Native American, and all kinds of different backgrounds, as you can imagine, going back. Well, this photo, I met Carlos a couple times. This was one of the first times I was actually playing at a fundraiser in the foothills of Albuquerque at the home of Ed Romero, the embajador, the ambassador, who was ambassador to Spain, who we visited when he was ambassador when we were in Madrid. Well, me and my brother, that's my brother Lorenzo on the right, we were playing New Mexico music, violin and guitar music, polkas and waltzes. It was very nice, a lot of people. And in walks Carlos Santana and his wife. And so they were there to help raise money. And so I'm playing, and Jorge was with him, his brother, and we know him, we know each other, we know them. So I'm playing my guitar, and Carlos Santana right there in the black, he comes up right in front of me. I'm playing like this. freaking out. And he comes up right in front of me and stands 2 feet in front of me and just looks at me. And then he starts going like this. I just shook my head. I'm like, I'm playing guitar in front of Carlos Santana. And I told him, you play. And he just goes, no, no, no. And he was a very nice guy. My point is this is one of the things that you get to do when you're a historian. I'm showing you this not just to brag. A lot of times people say, you got a history degree? What are you going to do with that? This. There I am in Mexico City around 2015. Me and Rick Hendricks went down there to look at documents in the Archivo General de la Nación, the National Archives there. That's the cathedral in the back, and this is one of the streets we would walk along. You have to walk a long ways to get to the archives, but that was our exercise for the day. And so, you know, when you go to the archives, all of these archives, whether it's the National Archives in Mexico City or the Civil Archives in Zacatecas, Mexico, or the National Archives in Madrid, or the Archivo de las Indias, the Archives of the Indies in Sevilla. I've been there a few times. You can't just walk in and say, I'd like to look at some documents. They just don't let you do that. You have to have a letter of introduction. We would usually take a letter of introduction from the State Record Center and Archives. And while I was doing all that in between 2002 and 2012, I worked at the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. So I'd get a letter of introduction from the Archbishop, and we would take that with us. And in Mexico City, it could take a day just to get your credentials because it was so bureaucratic, and they're not going to just let you go in. And, you know, the good old days, when you go to these archives, if you had a citation, you just go up to a little window and you hand the citation, then you go sit at your research table, and they bring you the legajos or the notarias, the Inquisition, Inquisition, notaries, and they're big books. They're the original documents from the 1600s, from the 1700s, and you have white gloves and you're wearing a mask. Wearing a mask is no big deal for a historian. You have to do it all the time in archives. And you look through and you find your document. And back then you would just get a piece of paper they'd give you, fill out the pages you want, and they would photocopy them and then mail them to you back at your home in Albuquerque. And, you know, that was great because only about 8 or 9 months later, you get your documents. It took a while, but now it's changing. Even the last time I was there was about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's changing, sadly. Well, the good news is a lot of stuff is being digitized now. You could look at a lot of stuff on Pares. That's P-A-R-E-S. You could look at Spanish archives. They don't have everything, but you can find a lot of documents, New Mexico documents, and they're digitized, and you can look at them, read them, print them out. But the downside to that is you don't get to go to Sevilla. You don't get to go to Madrid. You don't get to go drink una copa de vino tinto, a cup of red wine, or go to the tapa bar, you know. But things are changing, and now you go and you give your citation, you sit at a computer screen, and the document you want comes up nice and digitized, but that's it. In the old days, you could look through the whole book and you'd always find stuff. You go, I didn't know about this. This is a great document. You know, I didn't know about this. Look at this. And you get that one copied. Now you just get what you asked for, and that's it. So things are changing.
I have a question. Speaking of places, and you mentioned Zacatecas, isn't it in that specific neighborhood where Cristobal Oñate first got into Mexico City? I think he has a house over there. Do you know about that?
I don't know about it, but it makes sense. Because are you talking about Juan de Oñate's father?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was from the Basque Country and he came over. So when you came over from Spain, typically you get on your ship in Sevilla, then you stop off in the Canary Islands to get water, food, supplies, go to the bathroom one last time before you wait 12 weeks to get to Havana, Cuba. Then you'd stop off in Havana. same thing, supplies, and then you get to Veracruz on the Mexican coast. Then typically most people would probably go to Mexico City. So I don't know exactly where he went, but that would have been in the 1530s when he went, I think, because then he was a soldier under Nuño de Guzman. He was the mean conquistador. And they went into Nueva Galicia, established Nueva Galicia, and they established the city of Guadalajara. So he must have been knocking around there, but that's the colonial, you can see the architecture, it looks like Spain. But that's the cathedral in the background. If you go over there and take a left, there's the Zócalo, the huge plaza. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Mexico City. Okay, then you know what I'm talking about. All right, next. There I am with Dr. John Kessel. This was 2019 at the Historical Society of New Mexico's annual conference. We were honoring him, and it was just good to see him. He was my mentor at UNM, and he chaired my thesis committee, and he's just a great guy. He got me started on my career as a historian, and I was lucky at this. I got to serenade him with Las Mañanitas. So that's John Kessel right there. Let's talk a little bit about paleography, because to be a historian, and especially a state historian, it's important to know how to read documents, especially Spanish documents in New Mexico. Paleography is the study of historic writing systems and the deciphering and dating of historical manuscripts, including the analysis of historic writing. Anybody who's ever done historic research in any language knows that every document has almost its own language. Sometimes you have a scribe or whoever's writing the document with a fantastic hand. Sometimes it looks like, Dios mío, I don't know, it's awful. Or the document itself looks bad. You have to look at how things are abbreviated. So this right here is from 1793 in Abiquiu. It's the baptismal record for Father Martinez of Taos, Padre Martinez. And you look in the margin, it says Antonio Jose. Those are his baptismal names. Vecino, that meant a resident. It meant he was not Native American. It doesn't mean he's Spanish or pure Spanish or only Spanish. It just means he's not Puebloan. He's not Genízaro. There are a lot of words they used back then that are not politically correct today for Native Americans, like Indios Bárbaros or Gentiles, Gentiles, because they weren't Catholic, but you can get a lot out of a document. But he was a vecino, and it says at the top, en 20 días del mes de enero. See, hen, it looks like an H-E-N with a little circle. That's enero, January. The 1700, S-E-T-E-Z with a little s, you have to expand that to 700. Y 93, yo, Fray José de la Prada, MNTRO is minister de esta misión de Abiquiu, of this mission of Abiquiu. Let's see, where does it say? It goes, I can't see all the way over there. Can somebody do paleography?
It's a B and then a little E up above, I think. B-E.
Oh, hijo legítimo, L-E-G with a little O, de Severino Martín y de María M with a little A del Carmen Santisteban. Those are the mom and the dad, and it gives the padrinos, the godparents, and this is a baptismal record. So documents. When you work at the State Record Center and Archives, you're dealing with documents. Before 1680, we have very little because of the Pueblo Revolt. Most civil and church documents were destroyed. But we have a handful, and this is the oldest one we have that deals with New Mexico history. It dates from 1621. And it's a letter from the viceroy, the virrey in Mexico City, to the priest in New Mexico, talking about the challenges they're having converting the Pueblo people. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, okay? But if you look at the top, it says, Don Felipe, por la gracia de Dios, Rey de Castilla. That's Don Felipe, King of Spain. By the grace of God, King of Castilla de León. All of these are his titles. All the way to about here. Of Aragon, Mallorca, Corsica, all of his world empire. So you can get an idea, not just of the history of New Mexico, but the history of Spain by looking at these documents. And you can see how they saw themselves. They, from their perspective, ruled the world and were remaking the world in their image. But the Pueblos had a different idea, right? We just don't have documents that have their perspective. But the Pueblo revolt kind of gave us their perspective. This is a document from 1712. This is the document where Juan Paez Hurtado, he was the second in command of Diego de Vargas, says, we need to commemorate that guy, Diego de Vargas. He brought us in 1692, and we haven't done anything. So this is where he says we need to have a fiesta in Santa Fe. But it wasn't anything like what we have now, or what the entrada or anything. He says, he goes, he's talking to his soldiers. It says in this document, we can't meet in the Casas Reales, the palace of the governors, because it's fallen apart and it's raining and there's water coming through. So they're meeting in someone's house. And he says, you know, we're going to do this. And what we're going to have is a priest is going to say mass. He's going to give a homily. There'll be vespers, and then there'll be a solemn procession through the streets of Santa Fe. And that would have been carrying Our Lady of the Rosary, Nuestra Señora del Rosario, La Conquistadora, now called Our Lady of Peace, Nuestra Señora de la Paz. And it was a very Catholic religious fiesta. Fiesta means feast, a feast day. And the fiesta would have been a celebration, and it says we're going to pay for all this, and you're all going to pay for it to the cabildo, the town council, and you are mandated to attend. There was nothing. There was no reina. There was no conquistador dressing like Vargas or anything like that. That's not till the 1920s or so. But these are the kind of documents you see. It says in La Villa de Santa Fe, en 26 días del mes de septiembre. Yeah, and we still have the fiestas around that time, 16th of September. Genealogy is a big part of what we do at the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives. A lot of my questions are about family history. So again, paleography is very important. This is the will of Antonio Gurule, the son of Santiago de Gurule. He was Grolet, Jacques Grolet from La Rochelle. That's the guy I researched in France. Well, this is his son, and this is a will. This is where he made out a will. I love these documents because especially when you get to Spain and Mexico, they're a lot more detailed. And New Mexico did not have a lot of material wealth, but here in New Mexico, it's more things like, I leave all my cows to my son. I leave all my goats to my daughter. You know, in Zacatecas and Mexico City, there's money and wealth to leave for some families. But in these documents, it does, New Mexico wills, they don't list their parents. It's so weird. It's so strange because they list their wives and their kids and who they owe and who owes them. But what I do love about these documents is they always say in these documents, I want to be buried in the robe of St. Francis under the altar of the church, La Parroquia, the parish church. And they always say, and I choose as my advocate on Judgment Day, the Virgin Mary.
Wow.
because they know she's going to be nice to them. Genealogy. This is a marriage record from 1779. This is one of my ancestors. If you look at the margin, it says Jose an next line, Toño, Ga, next line, Yegos, con Ma, next line, Ria, Petrona, Vecinos. It's an interesting document. They're called residents. Okay, taxpayers. You know, they're not Puebloan. They're not Genizaros, the servant slave class. Well, this document lists them. It's Jose Antonio Gallegos. It doesn't list parents. This is at San Ildefonso. But if you look in the map, see where it's all scratched out around a little over halfway down? It says Jose Antonio con Maria. Her name is scratched out. This says Petra Coyota de esta jurisdicción. That means she's about 75% Native American. And from this document, of this jurisdiction, I assume she's Puebloan from San Ildefonso. And this is a document on my mom's side. I love this document because this is a baptismal record of one of their kids. I descend from one of their sons, but this is one of their daughters. I won't read the whole thing to you, but if you see her on this line, María Josefa, hija legítima de Antonio Gallegos, español, y de Petronia, India Coyota. That's really confusing for genealogy. Is she part Native American or is she Indian, Native American? It says India Coyota. So whatever it is, I know for a fact that she is my ancestor and she's Native American. Let's talk a little bit about the Historical Society of New Mexico and State Archives. The Historical Society of New Mexico was established in 1859, right early in our territorial period. And one of the major things they did, they wanted to preserve our history, but they also preserved our documents, because when the Americans came in 1846 to 1848, all of our archives were in the Palace of the Governors, and they were not being cared for. We have documents in the Spanish archives of New Mexico. We have documents that are inventories of what were in New Mexico in like 1720 or 1780. And sadly, when you look at it, a lot of the stuff we don't have anymore. But what they did was preserve those documents, because the Americans were taking them and throwing them in the streets. And people were grabbing the documents and using them to wrap up meat and maybe make puros. You know what puros are? Cigars. Okay. But they grabbed these documents, and that's essentially the beginnings of the state archives. And for about 100 years, there's a lull because of the Civil War and the two battles at Valverde and Glorieta here in New Mexico. But essentially, the Historical Society was funded by the state. And the archives were as well. It's in 1959 that they are separated. The state took over the archives, those documents, and to this day, the colonial documents of New Mexico, which are housed where I work at the State Archives and State Archive Center, they are owned by the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So what happens then is the Historical Society separates and becomes what it is today. What is it, 501? What, I don't know. Yeah. So that's what they are. And I love this photo. This is from where my dad was from in the 1890s. That's Mora. And that's a procession. And those are the Carmelitas. They're wearing tapalos. It looks like Morocco or something. But those are my people. This is the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives. I probably shouldn't joke as much as I do, but I like to joke. When you go to Mexico City to the National Archives, the archives are housed in a prison, what used to be a prison. And when you go, it's a big building. In the center is a big circular like courtyard with a roof now, but it used to be the courtyard where all the prisoners would hang out or exercise or do whatever. And then you had these buildings coming up like spokes, And those were the cells where they kept the prisoners. But now in Mexico City, those cells are where they keep ancient documents from the 1500s, 1600s, all the way up to modern times. Well, I joke, well, that's our archives, and it does also look kind of like a prison. That's on Camino Carlos Rey. Initially, the design of this building was supposed to be New Mexico colonial style, like Puebloan, but it was just too expensive. So they did that instead. That's my old office. I had that office for about 4 years. Now they've moved me into a smaller office. That happens at jobs. But that was my old office at the State Historian Division. And now, but let's look at this, the Office of the State Historian Division Director. That's the job, one of the jobs of the state historian. And here are some of the things that the state historian has to do. Manage the Office of the State Historian, meaning I have to oversee the Deputy State Historian and the New Mexico Historical Records Advisory Board. State historian has to enhance the public's knowledge and appreciation of New Mexico history, initiate and coordinate historical programs, and provide consultation services to state agencies regarding history and culture. And I've done all these things like all the other state historians to varying degrees. It just depends what the public needs, what the state agencies need, or anyone else for that matter. Again, the state historian is the only statutory member of the CPRC, Cultural Properties Review Committee. I'm also a member of the Historic Markers Subcommittee. So I help research and write, all those markers you see along the road, I help research and write those or correct them or vet new ones. The CPRC is created by the Cultural Properties Act to serve as a professional policymaking advisory board for historic preservation in New Mexico. So we also vote on historic places, buildings, people to be recognized as significant to New Mexico history. The Historic Records Advisory Board, that used to be in the Archives Division, now it's in mine. I'm the deputy chair of this board. The chair is Rick Hendricks, the State Records Administrator. It's a re-grant program. The National Archives gives us money, but we have to apply for, I find that so strange. We have to apply for money because we have to be part of this program. So every 2 years we apply, and I'm gonna make up numbers. If they give us $60,000, we have to hand out every year for 2 years, $30,000 to museums, archives, libraries, to any entity that wants to preserve their history, documents, photos, recordings, things like that. And again, we are connected directly to the National Archives. Again, I'm an ex officio member of the Historical Society of New Mexico. I looked up what that means. That means I'm a board member, not because of me, but because of my job, which is fine by me. I love that photo right there. Yes. So some of the things I do, I'm doing right now, right here today for you beautiful people. I give presentations. I give presentations to schools. There I am last weekend, a week ago at the Genealogy conference, talking to about 200 people. So that's one of the many duties I have. It fits the mission of the state historian, right? To preserve and promote New Mexico history and culture through outreach to the people of New Mexico. Media, there I am being interviewed. I do radio interviews, I do television interviews, I'm videotaped for documentaries. So I'm doing all kinds of things. It's quite amazing the things I've got to do as state historian. Now, oh, that turned out weird. Look at that. Anyway, I mentioned how in 2019 COVID hit, and the governor told all of us state workers, you need to go home and work from home. So that initially was just called working at home. Then we got this word called teleworking. We were told, well, now we're teleworking, okay? So I remember when it happened, we were all freaked out. You know, there's a pandemic, there's a virus out there, whatever it is. We were scared, excited. And so what happened was we were like, oh my gosh, Hendricks came and said, you're probably going to be working at home for 1 or even 2 weeks. So I'm going to be wrapping up. I'm getting the signal. So look, I got to Zoom tons of times because of people wanting programming, outreach, Facebook Live, YouTube. I created a video series about New Mexico history during COVID because I wanted to do my job. Reach New Mexicans and talk about New Mexico history. If you go to YouTube and type in New Mexico history in 10 minutes, there's 70 episodes.
Wow.
If you get bored, okay? So how to become a state historian? I've talked with Rick Hendricks about this a lot. Be ready when opportunity knocks. I hope you get an idea that I wasn't just sitting around waiting to be asked to be state historian. I was doing history work before I became assistant state historian. I was doing deputy state historian work before I became state historian for 6 years. So that's how you do it, or it's one of the many ways you do it. And finally, I also am a folk musician. I bring that into my presentations. I do a presentation on the history of New Mexico through Hispanic music. I do sing corridos and alabanzas and alabados, inditas, all that music. And it's part of what I do. It enriches not just my position, but it enriches the division of the Office of the State Historian and the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives. Questions? Look at that photo of the old State Record Center and Archives on Guadalupe Street. That's probably from like the late 60s, I think. Question?
Rob, great presentation. I'm hoping.
Let's take it back.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
I'm hoping you can clarify a lifetime history for me in New Mexico history. And I'm going to use your judgment as my final.
Okay, let's hear it.
All of my life, I have said Archbishop Lane.
Oh,
I had a tour guide in Santa Fe who said, no, it was Lamar.
No, c'est là.
And you said today, Lamy. So from now on, what should I,
Lamy.
Merci.
and what?
Why? Because that is how you say it in French. Lamy. That's just how I say it. Now, okay. Padre Martinez of Taos, I showed you his baptismal record. He's one of my favorite people in New Mexico history. And he ran afoul of Archbishop Lamy over tithing. And Lamy excommunicated Padre Martinez. I descend from Padre Martinez's little sister, Maria Estefania, on my mom's side. So he's my great, 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 great uncle. So when I talk about him in closed circles, I call him Archbishop Lamy. To be fair, he was also a very fascinating and interesting person, but I say Lamy. But then how do we say the little town?
Lane.
I'm going to say, in the spirit of diplomacy, say it how you want.
Thank you.
well, just real quick, Rob. Most cities in New Mexico, villages, counties, do not have a historian. They might have a history museum like here in Albuquerque. And I know we've talked about the whole Oñate statue controversy, Albuquerque. Your role as the state historian is to stay out of local government history issues, or how does that work?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Stay out is it depends what that means. Okay, first of all, the state historian does not have a role in putting up statues and monuments. My office doesn't put up statues and monuments. My office does not take them down. Okay. Obviously, I can have an opinion. I try to be balanced with my opinions because they are controversial topics and there are different perspectives on those things. But that's an interesting question if I can expand on. I'm not trying to dodge the issue, but I think a lot of people have misconceptions of what the state historian can or can't do. Some people think I can do everything and anything. Some people think I run the archives. I don't. That might go back to the days when Myra and Jenkins was both archive director and state historian. So I don't know if I don't have a mandate to stay out of politics. What I try to do is self-regulate. And the point, I'm glad you brought this up because I forgot to.
It's a local government issue because the property belongs to local government,
My job is to do historical research and present an interpretation of documents. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, in a sense, I have a certain amount of, what's the word, authority, because I'm the state historian. But this is how the job has changed, though, with social media, with Google, with documents being online, family search. There are so many people who are historians now out there, whether they're avocational historians or professional historians, there's so many. So they're difficult waters to maneuver. So one of the hardest things that I welcome the challenge, but anybody who's gonna be a state historian has to consider the Puebloan perspective, the Comanche, Dene, Genízaro, Apache perspective, the Spanish perspective, the Catholic perspective, and then in there, the Jewish and Moorish perspective, the Mexican perspective, the African perspective, because we have Black history starting in 1539 with Esteban, and colonists that came here were part African. And then we get to the Mexican period. We have to consider that. Then the French people start showing up. Then those Americans start coming along the Santa Fe Trail, and Americans aren't just white Anglo people. There's all kinds of people coming. There's Jewish people, there's Protestants. Have to consider the Texans who tried to take us over in 1841 and we stopped them. They tried again in 1862 and they succeeded for about 10 minutes and then we stopped them.
42 days. 42 days.
Okay, I'm a little biased.
Prior to Curry in 1947, I always wondered about if Twitchell had any significance as or ad hoc as being termed the state historian.
I certainly, Twitchell had significance,
Yeah.
Definitely, but he was not named state historian that I'm aware of. He might have been considered the authority. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
But you had people like Lansing Bloom,
Okay.
and then you also had people doing digging up places, Bandelier. So there were a lot of people doing a lot of things, but Twitchell is definitely one of the giants, that's for sure.
Well, his book, Leading Facts in New Mexico History,
Yeah.
certainly put you to sleep.
Oh. Well, I hope my history doesn't, but yeah, those.
And John's doesn't either.
John's is amazing. I think that's it. They're getting one more. Let's.
I was just wondering, because I think it's amazing the work you've done during the pandemic to reach out, but I was just wondering about how kids and youth are responding when you have presentations in schools.
They respond really well. I'm lucky. I taught high school for 10 years. So, I know how to relate to teenagers. I'm kind of immature, so I think it works to my advantage. I like to say I have a young mind. Okay. But the thing is they do respond, but you really gotta get the story to them. That's, to be honest, when I started doing, and I continue through with my video series, go and watch it if you haven't. I did it based on teaching
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
I didn't do it as a state historian, really. I kind of just said, you want to have a story. So they respond really well. I'm talking to some teachers right now who want me to go give some talks to their 12th graders and 7th graders about New Mexico history. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Well, I got